The desert has a way of stripping men down to their truest form. In the Arizona Territory of the late 1800s, survival meant more than courage, it meant respect for the land, an understanding of its moods, and a hard-learned humility before its merciless power. Few newcomers understood this truth until it was too late. The sun burned without mercy, the air shimmered with heat, and the land stretched outward in every direction, endless, silent, and cruel. On this day, James Walker, a surveyor for a railroad company, found himself at the mercy of such a land. His task was simple on paper: chart a stretch of desert terrain, note its elevations, and determine whether steel tracks could one day be laid across it. On maps back in Washington, the desert looked like blank space waiting to be filled. Out here, it was a graveyard of the unprepared. Walker had begun the morning full of confidence, his leather hat pulled low against the sun, his instruments neatly packed in a canvas satchel. He had water enough, or so he thought, and the stubborn resolve of a man paid to do a job. Yet the desert is deceptive. Hours stretched on, the horizon never drew closer, and the merciless heat seemed to climb straight from the sand into his bones. By noon, his lips had cracked. His canteen, once so reassuringly heavy, sloshed with the last few swallows. He scanned the horizon, praying for any sign of scrub or shadow. Nothing. Just the wavering mirage of water that danced and mocked him with every step. Then the storm came. It did not announce itself with thunder or warning, but with a sudden wall of brown rising from the south. At first Walker thought it a distant cloud of smoke, maybe a brush fire, but then the wind shifted. The storm raced toward him, faster than a horse could gallop. The desert floor began to tremble with a low, hollow roar, the sound of millions of grains of sand whipped into the sky. Walker froze. He had heard of sandstorms, but nothing could have prepared him for their ferocity. He wrapped his kerchief over his nose and mouth, pulled his hat low, and tried to crouch against a dry wash. It was useless. Within seconds, the world disappeared into choking darkness. Sand bit into his skin like knives. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe through the suffocating cloud. And then the dunes shifted. The storm howled and twisted, moving sand like water. Walker felt the ground beneath him crumble. One step forward became a plunge. Sand cascaded over him, filling his boots, pulling him downward. He clawed upward, but every movement only invited more sand to pour down. His kerchief tore away. He screamed, but his voice was smothered before it left his throat. Within moments, James Walker was buried alive. The desert closed over him like a lid, sealing him in a coffin of earth. Darkness pressed against his eyes. He could no longer tell up from down. Sand filled his ears, his nose, his mouth. He spat, coughed, gasped, each breath shallower than the last. Panic clawed at his chest as he realized he was entombed beneath the desert's shifting skin. He thought of home then, of the wooden farmhouse back in Missouri, the cool sound of the river near his childhood fields. He thought of his mother's hand on his shoulder the day he left. Her last words, "Be careful, Jamie. The West takes men quicker than bullets." Now, those words returned to him with cruel precision. His arms thrashed, but the weight of the sand pinned him. His lungs strained for air that would not come. He tried to pray, but even words deserted him. Above, the desert lay silent again, as if nothing had happened. The storm drifted farther north, leaving behind a smooth dune where a man once stood. Vultures circled lazily in the blazing sky, indifferent witnesses to another life swallowed by the land. For James Walker, every heartbeat became a countdown. Alone, unseen, and muffled beneath layers of desert sand, he was as good as dead, and yet unknown to him. Salvation was moving across that same desert ridge, a pair of eyes trained to read the land, a warrior who could hear what others would never notice, a man who would soon pit his bare hands against the desert's grave. When the last edge of the sandstorm drifted away, the desert looked untouched. The wind, having spent its fury, fell quiet, leaving only the shrill hum of heat rising from the scorched ground. The air was still, but it was not a comforting stillness. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the ears, the kind that reminded a man that he was very small in a land that wanted him gone. The dune where James Walker had stood was now a smooth, unbroken slope shaped into cruel beauty by the storm. It could have been there for 100 years. No footprints, no scattered satchel, no sign of panic or struggle remained. The desert had buried him as neatly as a gravedigger patting down fresh soil. Only the sky betrayed life. Far above, a handful of vultures had appeared, circling lazily on unseen currents. Their dark wings cut across the blazing sun, casting fleeting shadows on the ground. They did not hurry, for they knew the desert's rhythm. What it claimed, it rarely gave back. Beneath the dune, Walker fought a private war, his body strained against the suffocating weight pressing down on him. Sand shifted with each twitch of his limbs, trickling into his clothes, grinding into his skin. He tried to claw upward, but every desperate push sent grains collapsing back, refilling the space as quickly as he cleared it. It was like drowning, only the water was solid, hot, and merciless. His chest convulsed with the effort of breathing. The cloth of his kerchief had torn away in the storm, and now each gasp pulled in sand as well as air. Fine grain scraped down his throat, stuck to his tongue, and burned in his nose. He coughed violently, and the cough stole what little oxygen was left in his shallow prison. Darkness pressed in. He could not tell where the surface was or how deep he lay. For all he knew, he was already far beneath the dune, unreachable. His mind screamed at him to keep fighting, to keep clawing, but his body betrayed him. His arms were growing heavy, his muscles trembling with fatigue. Is this how it ends? He thought. Not in a firefight, not by fever or famine, but under a pile of sand where no one will ever find me? Images flashed in his head, his mother's hands, worn from work but gentle when she touched his cheek. The little river near his Missouri home where he had skipped stones as a boy. The proud face of his foreman when he was chosen to chart this stretch of land, trusted to map the future of a railroad that would span a continent. All those memories seemed distant now, washed in the heat and the darkness. His lungs burned. Each breath came shorter, more ragged, more desperate. The silence around him was worse than the storm's roar. In that silence he could hear only two things: the hammering of his heart and the hiss of sand trickling into the crevices of his shallow grave. Then, through the suffocating quiet, came something else. A tremor. At first, he thought it was his mind breaking under the strain, inventing hope. But no, it was there. A faint vibration, a shift in the ground. It might have been the dune settling from the storm's violence. Or perhaps it was something moving above, an animal, a man, or maybe just a trick of his fading senses. He couldn't know. But in the suffocating dark, that tiny difference was enough to cling to. Walker's panic slowed, not from calm but from surrender. His thrashing stilled. His mind whispered, "If there is something above, let it find me. If not, then let the desert take me quickly." Above ground, the desert remained outwardly calm. The vultures wheeled higher. The sun blazed. The silence was nearly perfect. But the land was not as empty as it seemed. There were eyes trained to notice the slightest ripple, ears tuned to hear what no surveyor could hear. Somewhere not far from the dune, a man walked with the patience of someone born of the desert, and he had already noticed that the sands had moved where no storm alone could account for it. To most eyes, the desert was empty, endless, a place without secrets because there was nothing at all. But to an Apache warrior, the land spoke. Every stone, every brush of wind, Every mark in the sand carried meaning. To survive here was to read those meanings with a precision sharper than any blade. Haye was such a man. His people called him the one who listens. Even as a boy, he had heard things others missed, the rattle of a snake beneath a rock, the faint change in wind before a storm, the difference between the silence of the land at rest and the silence of the land when death lingered near. That gift had saved lives before. It was about to save one more. Haye was not wandering aimlessly. He had set out that morning to hunt. His bow was slung across his back, and his eyes scanned for jackrabbit tracks, for the faint split in the sand where a quail might have scurried. But as he crested a ridge, the storm struck. He crouched low against its fury, pulling his blanket tight around his shoulders, waiting until the sky cleared and the winds passed. When the world finally stilled, he rose again, eyes narrowed. The desert had changed. It always did after a storm, but this time something was wrong. Ahead, the dunes bore the marks of violence rippled differently than the rest, disturbed in ways he recognized not as nature's hand, but as struggle. To anyone else, it would look like nothing, just wind and sand. But Chi's instincts tightened. The land told him a man had been here, a man the storm had swallowed. He moved closer, stepping lightly, the way his father had taught him. Leave no mark unless you must. His gaze swept across the surface, sharp as an eagle's. There a faint sag, barely noticeable in the curve of a dune. Sand resting where it should have still been shifting. A place where the silence of the desert was not true silence but smothered breath. Haye stopped. He crouched, pressing his palm to the ground. He listened. At first there was nothing. Then, faint as a whisper, he felt it. A vibration. Weak, uneven, but unmistakable. The earth trembled with the shallow movement of a man buried alive. Most would have dismissed it. The storm had claimed its victim. What sense was there in digging against a mountain of sand and risking his own life for a stranger? Yet Chi did not hesitate. The desert was cruel enough. Men need not add to its cruelty by turning away. He cast aside his blanket and weapons, dropping to his knees. His hands plunged into the scorching sand. It burned, but he ignored the pain. He dug like a wolf clawing into the earth, scooping great handfuls, flinging them aside. The desert resisted, collapsing inward as quickly as he worked, but he did not stop. His breaths came steady, timed with each plunge of his arms. The silence around him broke, replaced by the scrape of sand against skin, the rhythm of his labor, the thud of his heart in his chest. Sweat ran down his brow, dripping into the earth. Still, he dug. Minutes passed. Doubt flickered. Was he chasing a ghost, some illusion of the storm's aftermath? But then his fingers brushed against something not sand. Something softer. Skin.ch pulse surged. He dug faster, freeing an arm, then a shoulder. He grabbed hold and pulled. The body came reluctantly, heavy with the weight of sand. For a moment, it seemed lifeless. The man's head lolled, lips pale and cracked. Chi pressed his ear close to the mouth. A breath. Shallow, ragged, but a breath. The desert had not claimed him yet. Haye hooked his hands beneath the man's arms and dragged him upward, tearing him free of his sandy tomb. The body coughed violently, spitting out a mouthful of grit. The sound was harsh, ugly, but it was the sound of life. The surveyor blinked, his eyes glazed from the ordeal. His gaze fixed on the shadow above him, the outline of a warrior with skin darkened by the sun, hair bound back, chest streaked with sweat and sand. To Walker's fading mind, it was as if the desert itself had sent a spirit to drag him out of the grave. But to Chi, there was nothing mystical about it. A man had been dying, and he had chosen not to let him die. He laid the stranger gently on the ground, shielding him with his own body from the beating sun. The desert stretched around them, vast and indifferent. But for the first time since the storm, it felt as though the silence had been broken not by death, but by the will of two men clinging to life. The sun bore down mercilessly, as though it wanted to reclaim the life that Chi had just dragged from the sand. Heat rippled off the desert floor in waves. The air shimmered like fire. The silence had returned, broken only by the rasping coughs of the half-buried man and the steady rhythm of the Apache warrior's breathing. James Walker lay sprawled on the ground, pale and limp, his chest rising in shallow bursts. His lips were coated with grit, his eyes swollen nearly shut. When he coughed, the sound was jagged, as though his lungs themselves had been scraped raw by the desert. Each breath seemed uncertain, balanced between life and suffocation. Sehi knew the danger. The storm might have passed, but the greater enemy remained, the sun. A man could survive a night in the cold desert air, but a single afternoon beneath that burning sky could finish what the sand had begun. There was no time to hesitate. He dropped to his knees beside the stranger and set to work with nothing but his bare hands. First, he cleared the last clumps of sand clinging to the man's face, digging it out of his mouth, his nose, the corners of his eyes. Walker groaned faintly, a sound more animal than human, and tried to turn his head. She pressed him still with a firm but careful hand. He reached for his waterskin, tilting it to let a few drops fall onto Walker's cracked lips. At first, the man coughed violently, choking on even that small mercy. But she persisted, letting the water trickle slowly until the coughing gave way to swallowing. "Breathe," he murmured in his own tongue, though he doubted the stranger understood. "Slowly. The desert takes fast breaths. Give it nothing." Walker's chest hitched, then steadied, if only slightly. The warrior glanced around. No shade for miles. Only stone, sand, and the unblinking eye of the sun overhead. He could not move the man far, not yet. His strength would fail quickly, and if he collapsed again, the desert would not give them a second chance. So Chi did what the desert had taught his people for generations. He improvised. He stripped off his own blanket, coarse and heavy with dust, and rigged it against his spear and the broken stalk of a yucca plant, making a small lean-to that cast a patch of shadow over the man's body. It was not much, but in the desert, even the smallest shade could mean survival. He returned to Walker's side. The man's breaths were steadier now, though weak. His eyes flickered open blue, clouded with pain and confusion. They locked on Chi's dark face, and for a moment, fear shot through them. Walker tried to speak, but only a cracked whisper came, "Water." Chi gave him another swallow, this time pressing the waterskin firmly to his lips. The man drank greedily, then coughed it back up, spraying water and sand together. Chi caught him by the shoulders, lifting him slightly, thumping his back until the coughing subsided. "Not like that," she said, though again the words were lost in language. He guided the waterskin to Walker's lips once more, letting him take only the barest sip at a time. The man obeyed now, swallowing slowly, his eyes still locked on the warrior as if trying to understand whether this was salvation or captivity. Minutes passed. The worst of the choking stopped. Color crept faintly back into Walker's cheeks, though his body trembled with exhaustion. Sehi studied him. His clothes, Eastern cut, leather boots, a satchel still half buried in the sand marked him as no tribesman, not even a frontiersman. He was a man of the railroad, or the army, or some government commission. That made him a stranger, perhaps even an enemy. But in this place, such things mattered less than the simple fact that he still breathed. The desert would have its chance at him again. Of that there was no doubt. But Chi had chosen to deny it today. And if the desert wanted this man, it would have to go through him. The warrior pressed his hands once more against Walker's chest, feeling the rise and fall of shallow lungs. He dug his fingers gently beneath the man's ribs, forcing him to cough again, clearing more grit from deep inside. Each cough sounded like tearing cloth, but afterward Walker breathed easier. Bare hands. That was all. Chi had hands hardened by years of carving stone, stringing boughs, pulling meat from bone. Now they were the difference between life and death, scraping sand from a dying man's lungs, shielding his body with crude shade, pouring water with patience instead of haste. And as the sun dragged slowly westward, Chi stayed there, kneeling in the sand, watching over the stranger with a patience as vast as the land itself. The desert could not have him. Not yet. James Walker had no sense of time. To him, life had become a flicker between suffocation and dim awareness. One moment, he felt himself sinking into blackness. The next, he was jolted back by the sting of grit in his throat or the faint trickle of water across his lips. His mind struggled to keep hold of reality, but it slipped like sand between his fingers. When his eyes opened, it was not to the sun or sky, but to the face of a man he could not place sharp eyes. Hair bound in a warrior's knot, skin bronzed by 1,000 desert days. For an instant, Walker believed he had died, and this was some desert spirit sent to carry him into the afterlife. But the spirit's hands were rough and real. They pressed firmly against his chest, jarring his ribs until another fit of coughing racked his body. He gagged, spat out a slurry of water and sand, and dragged in a gasp so deep and ragged it felt as though his lungs might burst. Air. Blessed. Burning air. The Apache warrior pulled him upright with surprising strength, supporting his weight as if he were nothing more than a sack of grain. Walker sagged against him, his limbs useless, his vision swimming. The world seemed to tilt and sway, but there was no denying it. He was alive. His throat burned when he tried to speak. The first attempt produced only a croak, the second a broken whisper. "Where am I?" The warrior did not answer. Perhaps he did not understand. Instead, he steadied Walker, guiding his trembling body away from the mound that had been his grave. They moved only a few steps before Walker collapsed, his legs buckling beneath him. The warrior lowered him gently to the sand. Walker gasped like a man surfacing after nearly drowning. The desert air seared his lungs, but even its heat was welcome compared to the suffocating darkness he had escaped. He pressed a hand weakly against his chest, feeling the thrum of a heartbeat that just moments earlier had been fading into silence. His mind reeled at the realization. He had been buried, not figuratively, literally entombed beneath the earth, smothered by sand until only the faintest twitch of his body had betrayed life. And yet now here he was, breathing, coughing, trembling, but alive. He turned his head slowly toward his rescuer. The warrior crouched beside him, his expression unreadable. Sand clung to the man's arms, caked beneath his fingernails, streaked across his chest and face. Those hands, the ones that had clawed through the dune, that had dragged him free, were raw and reddened, marked with tiny cuts. Walker's voice cracked as he forced the words out. You pulled me out." The warrior tilted his head slightly, as if the sound of English was strange to him. He said nothing. Walker's breath hitched again, another cough tearing through him. The warrior leaned forward, thumping his back with practiced force until the grit cleared from his throat. It hurt, but the pain reminded him he was still here, still breathing. The sheer weight of the moment crashed over him. He had been gone. Dead, almost. The desert had closed its fist around him, and yet this man, this stranger, had ripped him back into the world. He felt a surge of gratitude so overwhelming it nearly made him weep. His eyes burned, though from tears or sand he could not tell. The Apache shifted, bringing the waterskin again. This time Walker did not fight it. He drank, slowly, carefully, each swallow easing the fire in his throat. When he finished, he slumped back, too weak to thank his rescuer properly. But his gaze lingered on the man's face. For the first time since the storm, he realized the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of death. It was the silence of two men breathing together in the aftermath of struggle. The desert had tried to claim him. By all rights, he should have joined the countless bones scattered beneath its sands. Yet here he sat, gasping and trembling, because one man had refused to let the earth keep him. James. Walker had been pulled from the grave by the bare hands of an Apache warrior, and though words failed him, though his body still trembled on the edge of collapse, one truth burned in his mind as fiercely as the sun overhead. He owed his life to this man, and nothing in the world could ever erase that debt. James. Walker lay in the meager shade of the warrior's improvised lean-to, his body weak, but his mind sharpening with every breath he drew. Hours before, he had been certain he would never see the sky again. Now, though still racked by coughing fits, he was alive, and that truth pressed on him with an almost unbearable weight. He turned his head toward the man who had saved him. The Apache crouched a few feet away, his posture relaxed but alert, like a hawk poised on a branch. His eyes scanned the horizon as though every ripple of sand, every twist of heat in the air, might conceal danger. Only when he was satisfied did he glance back at Walker. Their gazes met, and for the first time, Walker truly studied him. The man's hair was bound back with rawhide, long strands darkened with sweat and dust. His skin bore the burnished hue of a life lived under the sun, his body lean but powerful. Across his forearm, Walker noticed faint scars, old wounds, perhaps from battles or hunts. His hands, raw from digging, flexed unconsciously, as though still remembering the desperate work of tearing him from the dune. Walker swallowed. His throat still ached, but he managed a hoarse murmur. "You saved me." The warrior's face betrayed no recognition of the words. No flicker of understanding crossed his features. Instead, he tilted his head, regarding Walker as one might regard a bird that had fallen from the sky, curious whether it would fly again or simply perish at one's feet. Frustration mingled with awe inside Walker. He wanted to thank him, to pour out the flood of gratitude boiling in his chest, but language stood between them like a wall of stone. He gestured instead, pressing a hand weakly to his chest, then pointing at the warrior. His cracked lips formed the word again, saved. The warrior blinked once, slow, deliberate. Then he gave the barest nod. It was enough. Walker sank back against the sand, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. The silence between them was heavy, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of two men bound by something beyond words. For Chi, the decision to save this stranger had not been made lightly, though it had been made quickly. His people had suffered at the hands of settlers and soldiers, their lands stolen, their families hunted. This man, with his strange clothes and foreign tools, could be one of those who sought to carve steel tracks across the land, who brought change that could not be undone. Yet when he found him beneath the sand, gasping for life, none of that mattered. In the desert, death was the true enemy. And so he had dug. And so he had saved. Now, watching the man breathe, Chi weighed his choice. The desert had spared him once. Should he allow it to spare him again? Walker sensed the weight of those eyes on him and struggled upright. Pain lanced through his chest, but he forced himself to sit, to meet the warrior's gaze as an equal rather than a helpless child. He placed his palm flat against the ground between them, a gesture without language, but one he hoped spoke of respect. The Apache did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he mirrored the gesture, pressing his hand to the sand as well. Two men from worlds that had clashed and bled, bound and silenced by the very earth that had nearly claimed one of them. Walker exhaled shakily. The bond was fragile, tenuous as a thread in the wind, but it was real. He could feel it. He could feel, too, that his survival no longer belonged to him alone. His life now rested in the hands of the warrior before him. As the sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the desert floor, the silence between them softened. It was no longer the suffocating silence of sand and death. It was the cautious silence of two men learning that sometimes, in the harshest land on earth, survival depended not on bloodlines or allegiances, but on trust. The first night was the hardest. James Walker drifted in and out of consciousness, his body trembling with exhaustion, his throat raw from sand and thirst. He remembered little except the flickering glow of a small fire, the faint scent of smoke, and the sound of someone moving nearby with quiet, purposeful steps. Each time he woke, the warrior was there, crouched close, watching him with the steady patience of a man who knew how to wait out storms. When Walker coughed, the Apache lifted him gently and gave him sips of water. When his body shook with chills despite the desert heat, the warrior draped a blanket across him. It was a care stripped of words, but not of meaning. Walker began to understand that survival here was not about speeches or gratitude. It was about action. By morning, his strength had returned only slightly. His lips still cracked with dryness, and his muscles ached as though he had been beaten. He tried to stand and nearly collapsed. The warrior caught him under the arm and eased him back down, a frown shadowing his features. Walker muttered, half delirious, I need to move. I can't stay here." The Apache ignored the words, pressing a clay cup of water to his lips. The message was clear. Not yet. The desert decided the pace, not Walker's stubbornness. Over the next 2 days, the warrior attended to him with the quiet skill of one who had lived his entire life in this unforgiving land. He gathered herbs from the sparse brush, crushing them into a bitter paste that he pressed against Walker's cracked lips and throat. The taste was foul, but the relief was undeniable. He showed Walker how to chew the fibrous stalk of the yucca to draw moisture, how to suck sweetness from the desert cactus without taking in its poison. At night, when the cold descended, the warrior built small fires from mesquite branches and stone. He did not speak, but he did not leave either. He sat close enough that Walker could feel his presence, a silent reassurance against the vast emptiness of the desert night. Walker tried, more than once, to bridge the silence with words. "My name is James," he croaked on the second evening, pressing a hand weakly against his chest. "James Walker." The warrior studied him without reply. Then, after a pause, he touched his own chest and said, quietly but firmly, "Chi." The name hung in the air, simple but weighty. Walker nodded slowly, repeating it under his breath, though his accent mangled it. The warrior did not correct him, but a flicker in his eyes suggested the effort had been noticed. From then on, the silence between them shifted. It was no longer impenetrable, but layered with small gestures, exchanged looks, and the occasional word, two men finding a rhythm without the need for shared language. Walker learned to watch Chi's movements, to mimic the way he gathered tinder or positioned stones to block the wind. He learned how to ration water, not gulp it in desperation. He learned that in the desert, shade was as precious as gold, and that a man could survive hunger far longer than thirst. But what struck him most was the way Chi moved through the land. The warrior did not fight the desert. He flowed with it, reading its signs as though it were a book written only for him. A bent blade of grass, a scatter of pebbles, the faintest line in the sand all told him something. To Walker, it was incomprehensible. To Chi, it was survival. One afternoon, when Walker tried again to rise and walk, his legs wobbled beneath him. Chi steadied him with one arm and handed him a length of wood cut from mesquite, pressing it into his hand like a crutch. Walker leaned heavily on it, taking one step, then another, until his lungs burned and sweat poured from his brow. When he collapsed back to the ground, he half expected the warrior to scowl at his weakness. Instead, Chi gave the faintest nod, as though acknowledging that even one step was a victory. It was then that Walker realized something profound. This man had no obligation to him. He could have left him to die in the sand or abandoned him once he was dragged free. Yet here he was, nursing him day after day, feeding him, teaching him, protecting him. The desert was harsh enough. Mercy was not its natural gift. And yet Chi had chosen mercy. On the third night, as Walker lay beneath a sky bursting with stars, he whispered hoarsely into the darkness, unsure if Kiafian understand, "I owe you my life." The warrior did not answer. But after a long pause, he added another branch to the fire, and its glow pushed back the cold. That was answer enough. By the fourth morning, James Walker's legs held him more firmly. He was still weak, still slower than he wanted to admit, but the fog of exhaustion had lifted from his mind. The desert around him no longer seemed like a blur of death and heat. It was sharp now, defined, ridges of red stone, the silver glint of dry washes, the prickled silhouettes of cactus against the horizon. For the first time since the storm, he felt like a man again rather than a ghost clawing for breath. See, I had risen before dawn. Walker woke to find him crouched on the ridge above their small camp, his silhouette etched against the paling sky. He was still, utterly still, watching the east where the first threads of light began to unfurl. There was something timeless in that posture, something that made Walker hesitate before disturbing him. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, flooding the desert with its merciless gold, Chi rose and descended silently back into camp. He carried no weapons in his hands, only a small bundle of dried food wrapped in cloth. Without a word, he placed it beside Walker. Walker looked down at the bundle, then up at him. He understood. This was no offering for breakfast. It was a farewell. "You're sending me on," Walker rasped, voice still coarse from days of healing. Hai met his eyes but said nothing. He gestured instead, first pointing eastward, toward a thin smear of green that marked the edge of distant settlement, then pressing his hand to his own chest. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. "Your path is there. Mine is here." Walker swallowed hard. Gratitude, sorrow, and awe tangled in his chest. He rose unsteadily, leaning on the mesquite branch Chi had cut for him, and took a long moment to steady himself. The bundle of food felt impossibly heavy in his hands, though it could not have weighed more than a pound. "I'll never." He began, then faltered. He wanted to say, "I'll never forget what you've done for me." But the words seemed too small, too thin against the vastness of the debt he carried. He tried again, simpler this time. "Thank you." The warrior's face did not soften, yet there was no hardness in it either. He inclined his head once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and then stepped back. Walker felt the urge to close the distance, to press a hand to the man's arm, to do something more than stumble away with a bundle of food and a heart full of gratitude. But he sensed that this moment was not his to shape. Chia had given him life. That was gift enough. Demanding more conversation, camaraderie, friendship would be to misunderstand entirely the nature of the desert's mercy. The silence between them was not empty. It was sacred. Walker turned east, toward the faint promise of safety. He took one step, then another. The staff bit into the sand, steadying him. He paused once to look back. Hai still stood where he had left him, a solitary figure against the endless horizon, the sun catching the edges of his form until he seemed carved from the very land itself. He did not wave. He did not call out. He simply stood, watching, until the distance swallowed the space between them. Walker faced forward again. Each step carried him farther from the man who had saved him, but closer to the life that had been returned to him. His heart ached with a strange duality, relief at surviving, and grief at leaving behind the one who had made survival possible. Hours later, when the settlement finally came into view, a cluster of buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, the faint sound of dogs barking in the distance, Walker nearly collapsed with joy. But as he leaned against a fence post, gathering his strength before approaching, he thought not of the people ahead, but of the man behind. He imagined Chi already vanished into the desert, moving with the silence of a hawk across the ridges, leaving no trace of his presence. To others, Walker's story might sound impossible, a man buried alive in the desert, saved by nothing but another's hands. But to him, it was the truest thing he had ever known. He touched his chest, feeling the beat of his heart. Each pulse was a reminder. He had been given back to the world, clawed from the grave by a man who owed him nothing and yet gave him everything. As the sun climbed higher, blazing over the land, James Walker walked on. He did not look back again, but he knew deep in his bones that somewhere behind him, in the silence of the desert, Chi walked to. And though their paths had parted, their lives would forever remain bound by that day when death reached out from the sands and an Apache warrior, with nothing but his bare hands, refused to let it win.